So Chanel, I spoke to 3 people recently who said that they were looking for jobs or they actually changed job because the remote work they felt was bad for their well-being and their mental health specifically. That is not something that I expect. So what do you make of that? Do you think that remote work can be bad for us?
So I think there's multiple viewpoints on remote work. And I think that when we take into account things like personality psychology and we think about how people's personalities sometimes do better in certain settings, there are pros and cons. So I don't think I want to go from a standpoint to say I'm for or against, but I'd rather suggest that we talk from a bit more of a holistic perspective. I think in terms of mental health, we know that there are certain core things that help drive our mental health, and connection and belonging are two of them that are good for us. And that's the two things that we typically neglect when we aren't feeling at our best. So potentially remote work does isolate people and can potentially be damaging to their mental health should they already be in a space where they are feeling lonely. They do perhaps feel that they don't have a support system or they don't belong. There's a lot of cases besides mental health as well for being back in office, but we'll get to that, I'm sure.
So I put a poll on LinkedIn to ask people whether they would consider changing their job situation to have more in-person contact. And I thought that it would resoundingly be towards the no. What actually happened was 55% said yes, 45% said no. I do think personality plays a big role in it. And obviously also who you work with. If it is people that you enjoy spending time with, you would want to see them more often. But the fact that people are saying, I would change job, and the people that I'm referring to, that are the examples, they like where they work. They like the people, but they just feel like sitting in a room on their own, where they spend 99% of the time just there, is not good for them anymore, which is telling. Um, I think what people tend to do is, so what do people complain about when they go into the office, for example, is they don't get anything done because they don't go there often. And when they do go there, they use it to catch up, and then they feel that their productivity suffers, which also then adds to the anxiety. So it's not it's either going to be one or the other, which I think is what we get wrong regarding this, is knowing what you're going to be doing when you are there and knowing what you're going to be doing when you are at home. What do you think are some of the pros of working more remotely? I mean, the both of us work remotely. You work in client office more than I do. For you specifically, what works in terms of your setup as it is now?
Maybe before I get into that question, so I just want to park that for a second. I just want to comment on what you were saying around the distraction and people feeling that their productivity sometimes suffers when they do go to the office. I think it has a lot to do with setting the expectation and clearly setting the expectation, but not just for what you're going to be busy with, but for how much you can deliver. I think, and that links and ties into your question about the pros. The pro for me is I get to set my pace. I know what I need to get to, and I know how much I need to get to when I'm working remotely, which is most of the time. And often that is also the time I get to utilize to catch up, to do my focus work, to get to the things that are more strategic in nature, things that I need to pay more attention to. I do need to maybe mention the fact that I am an introvert, and I do gather my energy by being on my own. So working in an industry like the industry we work on, where I love to work with people, it does drain my battery very quickly when I am isolated or when I am continuously in people's space. So knowing that and having really good set of self-awareness, I know what to expect from my deliverables in the various settings, which I think helps me leverage on the remote work. I think a pro also for working from home is that I get to balance my own personal priorities So being a mom of two small kids that are still I'm quite highly involved still. They still require a lot of
They're
assistance
very
from me.
dependent on you. Yes.
Very dependent still, which is lovely, and it's a huge privilege that allows me the privilege of being able to be more available for them, even though there is a downside to that as well, which we will get into when we speak to the cons. I think another potential pro is that I get to set up my environment of work that is best for me. So I can set up my environment without distraction. So I am quite inclined to get distracted by other things. So having an environment that is set up that is very specific to my work environment allows me to be more focused.
The focus, yeah.
Which I do think becomes a problem in certain setups when you don't have the luxury. I have also worked with a bunch of people that also work quite remotely, and their biggest struggle is they don't have a space in their home environment or their living environment where they can isolate and say, this is my workspace, and step away from it.
Which we both have, which makes it a lot easier.
Makes it a lot easier, which we set ourselves up for it from the get-go because we knew that was the way we were going to work. But for most people, they were plundered into this idea of remote work, and their lifestyle and their way of living wasn't necessarily pro remote work. So I think that is a pro for me, but it is a con for many other people because they don't have that flexibility. So they end up working in their bedrooms, for example, which is not ideal for their sleep hygiene. Or they're working in the kitchen where people are all over them and they, making food over them or whatever the case is. So they do feel like they lack focus and direction when they're working from home. So that's typically a pro for me, but it could be a con for someone else.
We know from the different clients we work with that some of our clients work in the office continuously. There's no remote work. Others work predominantly from home. And yes, the pro is flexibility. The pro is you get to focus on the stuff that you need to. But if we go to the con part of it, we do know that knowledge transfer is a really difficult thing to do, especially when new people come into the business. They struggle to get access to the people that are knowledgeable. And often they feel like outsiders because they don't know the people. They can't just send them an email and say, I need help, if they've not met before. And that creates a group of people that know and people that don't know. What we know from remote work is it works incredibly well when you've got a group of people that know exactly what they need to do, and they are highly skilled already, and they can just go and do their thing and execute with speed. But if you've got people that don't know what they're doing, they feel lost and trapped. And that makes them feel like outsiders. And as a result, they churn quickly. They don't stick around. So how do we fix that?
Sorry to interject, but I think a big thing there is that that is when the isolation and the belonging becomes an issue as well.
Yes.
Because when we onboard people into an employee environment, they need to feel part. They need to get a feel for what the culture is like. They need to understand how the way of work is. So referencing previous environments in which we have been exposed and worked, we have seen great successes when we have a bit of a hybrid model, but the hybrid model is also filtered by level of skill. So people who have been there longer, who have a better understanding of the environment, are more flexible in terms of their hybrid capacity. So being able to work from home more often than working from the office, where people who are new in the environment or are very unskilled in the environment or need to build their capacity still, they are less they have a less of a capacity for remote work because they haven't got the skills. So they're going to be going home, working from home, but not knowing what to do.
Yeah, that doesn't work. That's a waste of time.
Yeah, and the tools are super important. So having the tools, so things, and we know that we live in a very diverse socioeconomic environment as well. Not everyone, although the access to internet has become a lot better in recent years, there are a lot of people that don't have access to highly streamed internet, so a very fast line, or so things like having meetings or doing work on a central database becomes challenging when you don't have access to high internet. So then we're creating a bit of a diversity area again as well, which we need to take into account. I think to me, maybe linking to some of the pros, because that's where you kind of went with the conversation, one of the big cons that I personally experience working from home is, and it links to what I was saying around the flexibility of being able to be there when my kids need me or when I need to be at something, is being able to boundary my time. So what I often find, because I'm very passionate about my work and I also really care about what I do, which I think is most people's case, well, I would like to think so, and I end up struggling to set a boundary around my work hours. So it's very easy for me to step into my office and do emails at 7 o'clock at night, which potentially is damaging to the person who isn't working at 7 o'clock at night because they were in office from 8 until 5, where I had a bit of a more flexible day.
Yeah.
So we do know from past experience and work we've done with companies with the 4-day work week trial is that that does become a dilemma. So receiving emails and setting the tone that emails need to be sent at 7 o'clock at night really makes boundarying your work hours and finding balance really challenging. So that is a typical con that I do experience working from home as well. Yes, I think that's one of the big ones. I think that's the one that gets most people tripped up.
Spoke to a mom last night. She's an accountant who works for a Australian company. So obviously the work hours are a bit different due to the time zones. And she says mommy guilt is a massive thing, where you feel guilty for the fact that your kids are there and you should be spending time with them. And then at the same time, when you spend time with them, you think I should be working. So it's always one or the other, which is exhausting. And we used to complain about the fact that we had to commute. But I think commuting was actually, in hindsight, a really good buffer between work and life, because you could get rid of the guilt and you can do a lot of processing while you're sitting in the car. Whereas now, you just walk out that door and the kids are there and you're constantly feeling, but I should be there, or I should be there. And that's not ideal.
I think linking to that conversation, there's also a lot to say around the commuting and creating some space for processing, not just around the guilt component for parents, because we know that it's not just parents that experience that, but also the space between, filing. I want to call it your internal filing system. Commuting for a lot of people created that space. Yes. We know that there's implications, obviously, because people become used to not commuting, and the expense that goes with commuting has become part of their life cost, and now it was removed for a while, now we're putting it back. And that affects people, and I think that's one of the big barriers for people to enter back into the workspace, is they've gotten used to having a little bit more of disposable income, which they are now allocating towards other things, and now all of a sudden having to move back to the office or commute.
Or they move to a different city
Yes.
or province, like I did, which you can't just go back to where you were easily.
Yes, so it makes it a little bit more challenging financially for people as well, which is something that I think employers need to take into consideration when deciding on how they're going to approach maybe the hybrid work model going forward.
Because we see some businesses saying people need to be in the office more. They are quite strict on that. And it's large companies who spend a lot of money on office space, for example. But if you have 10,000 employees, it's very difficult to handpick and decide, how am I going to treat each of them so they perceive it as being fair. A blanket approach, and given the fact that people do different things, is not going to be an easy solution.
And we saw this in the past, where we worked in an environment where there was a very strict, some of the organization had very strict work hours and had to be at the office at a specific time. And on the consulting end of things, there was a lot of more flexibility because they had to travel to and from clients, and the way that in which they worked was a lot more flexible in terms of them determining how they were going to do it. And the resentment that built internally in organizations when there's not a clear understanding. I think the way that we navigate and mitigate that is by actually spending a lot of time with people explaining the purpose and the why. So why is this a benefit for certain people in an organization potentially and not for others? Or is there a possibility? And if you have a solution for making your work environment more remote or more flexible, how do we do it? I think something that is coming up in my mind is how we know that our brains work very primitively, actually. And the primitive triggers, some of them are autonomy. When we feel triggered on autonomy, we tend to go into a very primitive reaction and become quite emotional about what we're discussing. And I think that's what often happens when we're having this hybrid conversation or this remote work conversation, is the person who's actually being impacted by the decision is not really being heard in a sense. And I'm not saying this is everyone's case. I think in a lot of organizations it's also challenging to get, all 5,000,
10,000.
10,000 people's voices heard. But I think having a space where people are open enough to come and give suggestions around how they can make it more remote for themselves or how they can be more flexible, and it's almost also letting them think about the implications of doing that as well, not just for them, but for the organization, does create a sense of autonomy in organizations. Another one of our core triggers, and I'm referring to something called the SCARF model, is fairness. And we know that fairness is a big trigger for some people. When it feels unfair, then resentment builds and we become emotional. So speaking to the previous example of how we can make it work and how we can create context for people to understand why certain people need to be in office and why people don't, or how we can make it work to allow everyone a level of flexibility. But underlying all of those triggers, I think, is very strong leveraging on trust and communication. I think when trust and communication aren't part of the equation, that is when we get stuck.
It's an interesting thing to think that the way we work might be having a detrimental impact on our mental health and our well-being. And having the choice and having the agency to be able to change that, firstly, having the awareness that this is not good for me, or I need to make a change, is an interesting thing. Because the world went to remote work very suddenly, and not everybody was ready for it, and not everybody now realizes that it's the best thing for them. So it's probably going to be a continuous discussion. It's not an easy fix. But if businesses are flexible enough to allow people to be able to do what they can for their own well-being, I think that would be a good step in the right direction.
And I also think it goes both ways, right? So I think it's about self-awareness and people taking responsibility for their own mental well-being, but also understanding that they form part of a circuit that they have to form part of, and they need to contribute and they need to add value. And I think the isolation goes both ways. So as much as, having that mom guilt is sometimes good and bad, I think that there's a mental barrier there as well, because that anxiety around not being there for your kids can also not be good for your
absolutely for your well-being.
It goes both ways. I don't think there's, like you said, I don't think there's a clear-cut answer on this, and I don't think that it's necessarily going to ever be something that everyone agrees on. But I do think there are ways in which to make a hybrid system work, and there are ways in which to make it not work. And I think that is what organizations need to figure out around their own strategy and how they're going to approach creating a space where people can actually do what they need to do, because I think that's ultimately why you have it work, is to contribute and to add value, but also in a way where they can flourish and can be better versions of themselves, not just at the work, but also when they get home or when they are at home. So I think it's also the responsibility lies on both sides, on the individual side around creating an environment in which they can work, but also on the organization side in terms of creating support for people. So I think it goes both sides.
What typically happens when we say we're going to have a quick chat is it turns out not to be a quick chat. So before this becomes a 4-hour thing, we stop there.
Yes. I think if there's any thoughts from anyone watching this that they would like to share, or maybe potential topics that they would like us to pick our brains on, please do add them to the comment section so that we can get to them and share some of our thoughts. We're not saying they're the only thoughts, but they might be valuable seeds that can maybe grow and sprout into beautiful trees.
Yeah, we also try to figure this out as we go along. So these are the things that are on our minds, and we like talking about them.
Have a lovely Friday.
Lekker.